a very fine institution. They took the precise statements of the four Gospels, the accurate historical sources, and their pathological and medical knowledge, and they put together a very helpful article. All their study included the fact that everyone who was crucified was beaten before crucifixion. This was always done. Braided leather thongs with bits of metal and sheep bone or some other kind of animal bone embedded in them were used to lash the victim from the bottom of the neck all the way down to the back of the knees. At the time that he was being lashed, his arms were extended up and tied to a pole. He was in a slumped position. 2 lictors hit him with alternating blows. We don't know how many lashes these people received. There is no indication. But all the results would be that the bone and the metal rip into the flesh, deep contusions, lacerations into subcutaneous tissues, into the fabric of the muscles, pain, blood loss, circulatory shock would ensue. All 3 received this. Maybe Jesus had some exacerbated agonies because it is said of Jesus that when they took him back into the judgment hall after this, they put a robe on him. It would be a crusty old robe made of wool that would do nothing but agitate and irritate his open wounds. And then they jammed a crown of thorns on his head, hit him in the head with a stick, and spit on him. And at some point they ripped the robe back off him, which would again agitate and rip the wounds. There would be intense pain, blood loss, hematidrosis, making the skin hypersensitive. Add to that lack of sleep, lack of food, lack of water. And after all of that, then came crucifixion for all 3 of them. The Romans didn't invent it, but boy, did they perfect it. It was a slow death with maximum agony. The victims carried the cross, perhaps the cross piece, across the back of their neck and their shoulders, and their arms were tied to it. Jesus received help because apparently he wasn't moving fast enough or some other motivation. And so Simon of Cyrene was asked to carry his cross, and either he took the piece off the shoulders of Jesus and carried it for him, or Jesus was actually carrying his whole cross, and Simon picked up the bottom of it. It was banging along the cobblestones because Luke says he carried it behind him. Arriving at the place of crucifixion, they would be offered that sedation, which Jesus refused, and they would be thrown to the ground on their backs. The crosspiece would then be pulled under their shoulders, and their arms were nailed to the crosspiece. The Romans used nails. Archaeologists have found the remains of crucified victims from as early as the 1st century and earlier. And the nails were tapered iron spikes 5 to 7 inches long, about ½ inch in diameter, square. They were driven through the wrists rather than the palms of the hands so they could carry the full weight of the slumping body. And so, lying on his back on the ground, each of these 3 would be nailed to the crosspiece with these great square spikes driven through each wrist. The impaled victim was then lifted up, and the crosspiece was attached to the horizontal, often called the stipes. The feet were then nailed, the knees bent up, the feet were nailed with 1 nail, 1 foot upon the other, so that the victim could push up to breathe, to inhale and exhale, and pull up on the wounds to do the same. And whether pulling with the wrists or pushing with the feet, they would be pulling and pushing against the wound. By the way, the slumping condition and the bent knees was so severe that you couldn't breathe in that position. The soldiers could bring death in minutes by breaking the legs. If they broke the legs and the victim couldn't push up, he would die in minutes because he couldn't breathe. To survive, the victim would push up and pull up on the wounds. Insects would burrow into the wounds. into the eyes, the ears, the nose. Birds of prey would tear at the open sights. By the way, no one survived crucifixion. To confirm death in hours or days, when the Romans thought the person might be dead, the body was pierced with a lance. And it was pierced in precisely the exact spot in the heart in which the flow of blood and water, as is described in the Bible, would come out to indicate death. And by the way, all Roman soldiers were taught the most precise place in a human anatomy to put your lance. They were soldiers. They were killers. Each effort of the person on the cross to breathe would mean he had to pull himself up or push himself up, which would then rub the open wounds up the course of the rugged cross and then back down again, ripping and shredding those wounds further. The nails in the wrists would crush or sever the large sensory rimotor median nerve. And when a nerve is damaged and a nerve is pierced, the bolts of pain are relentless. The nails in the feet would likely pierce the deep perineal nerve, plantar nerves, with the same result. So you'd have vicious, relentless nerve pain through your feet, through your hands. And the weight of the body pulling against all these agonizing, torturous bolts of pain, struggles, pulling itself up, pushing itself up, breathing is shallow. You don't get enough oxygen. What do you get? Tetanic contractions, muscle cramps. Add to that dehydration, arrhythmias, congestive heart failure, pleural effusions. One can't even comprehend how painful all of it is. There's a word for it, excruciating. Excruciating. That's the most extreme word we know in English to describe pain. And it comes from Latin, ex crucia, out of the cross. Out of the cross. This is the experience of all three men. All three. But for one of those three, it was his destiny. But not just his destiny, ours as well. Now, the Jews should have known that instead of this proving that Jesus is not their Messiah, it did just the opposite. It proved that he was their Messiah. Look at Psalm 22. Let's go 1,000 years before. Psalm 22. 1,000 years earlier, to the time of David. Nobody